Thank you so much. I think we've had 5 fantastic presentations which really summarise a little bit of what is happening. So just like to thank you again for the presentations. It was fantastic. We've got about 20 minutes, and 25 minutes. What I'd like to do is really address 3 questions. So one is the question of the differences. The second is about what are the lessons that we can learn from you and from your projects. And then thirdly, what are the likely future directions? And I think that's really important for us. So we haven't got a lot of time. Look, are people keen to ask questions along those lines? While you're thinking of your questions, what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask Konyan if he will just make some comments, just in terms of a little bit about the differences between practice in East and West, if you like. But please think of questions that we can then direct to our team. Yeah.
Well, congratulations for very diverse, very interesting, different, all kinds of research. But basically, obviously, it's research or design-based research, design thinking research. So my question is, so you have a diverse perspective. So what do you mean Eastern perspective, for example? Why do you use, for example, medieval? Is a very Western term. So I'm thinking, because this altogether you have tried to express Eastern perspective. What you can make difference compared to Western, right? What is Western? What's Eastern? Because you are all based on the Eastern. And so that's one question. Why, I mean, the Japanese and Chinese, but in certain sense, in China, we consider Japanese culture as Western, you know. So that's, I think you maybe have to.
We're not Westerner, but I think I'm particularly interested in the difference of how people are tied to the community, and particularly in Japan, people really have a strong relationship with the village group, like the village. And I read while I was researching on the former study, the research said, like, say, in Thailand, even though they have the same agriculture, like rice growing, cultivation, they are not really, they don't know, like, if you come across a person from, you know, somewhere in Thailand and then ask where you're from, and they never answer like they're from like certain village. But in Japan, we always tie to the village, particular village, and I really wondered why. And even in a Asian culture, we have like different kind of relationship with the community, and like we Japanese still believe that dead people come back to the nature, like surrounding the mountains, water. So everything is deeply associated with the, like, you know, story of the ancestors. That's why we really care about the nature. And I think that's a really important to understand our culture. And I don't know, honestly, to be honest, I don't know really about other Asian culture, like in that perspective. But yeah, that might be relevant to some like indigenous culture, like in Norway and here, like Sami, or probably like, you know, there are so many like ethnic groups in the world, and that might be kind of, yeah, sorry, it went too long.
No, thank you. Can I ask, Levin, just from your perspective, is in terms of, do you feel pressure to adopt Western ways of thinking and practice in the work. So you live in Norway here. Is the pressure? How can you protect and preserve and still keep your Eastern culture without this pressure of this, homogeneity trying to make us all think and thinking that Western is better than Eastern, which of course it's not.
Yeah, thank you for asking this question. Yes, when I'm working at Oslo School of Architecture, and then sometimes I joke with my colleague, it's like one of the very few Eastern face in our floor. And then that's already a difference. And then so I think that in order to keep the Eastern perspective, which I absolutely on that track, is actually to bring in this kind of global vision to the school. Then means that when, for example, when we have the program in the far north, Tromsø, the focus, like the education up there, they will focus in the Arctic. But there are many kind of extreme landscapes around the globe. So the alpine zones in the Arctic could have some similarity and strangeness with the alpine zones in China. So even an education is located in the high north of Norway, we could still bring in another geography under this global vision. And then I think that's the way that to bring in the Eastern perspective. And also to bring students from Norway to China, they're gonna understand the different perspective. For example, in the outdoor culture, like a trail in China means very different than a trail here. Because when we think about the cultural mountains in China, and it has been constructed with a well-materialized path for thousands of years. So that means trail. But then here in Norway, maybe you know these Norwegian trekking routes. So it's, the trail is a mark, T, in the wilderness. So it's very different. And also, when students observe the outdoor tourists in the high mountain in China, they dress up also in a quite urban style. So there's a difference. And then I think when students experience that, and that could bridges this, Eastern-Western perspective. But
So it's a really good answer. So again, think globally, act locally.
Exactly, yeah. Global vision, local action.
It's such a key cliche, but it's so true. So thanks for the answer. Please, and then afterwards. That one? Sorry. Yeah. Oh no, sorry. God.
How to catch up. The only mountain climbing I ever did was as an exchange student in Nagano, Japan. So I've seen at least one trail on one big mountain and two peaks early in the morning. But the question I have for everybody is, when you're talking about these transformations, where are the soil suitabilities and the geology components of your research? Because from what I know, particularly in mountain geologies, it's very difficult to get year-round sanitary disposal systems. So if you're talking even about the lightest use, when you start talking about your circulation patterns and your loop paths, I miss that in all these things. I mean, there was some in the Lake and I've been to Lake Biwa too, so I just wonder where that is, because it can't just be an aesthetic design. There has to be the long-term capability to sustain the people's usage of the whatever level you're talking about. And it's very literal, and since the geology is not going to change and it's really expensive to bring soils in to dispose of human waste and other kinds of waste, it becomes a critical minimal criteria for doing any kind of transformation, at least from my experience.
Nian, would you like to try to answer that question? It's about saying that how do you work with existing ecologies and everything that's good about a place, and yet the expectations that people have about sanitary systems and modern technology, how do you resolve that conflict? I mean, it's the perfect thing that landscape architects do because they work with ecologies, you know? Do you want to have a try?
I feel sorry about that, because about ecological restoration, I think my practice experience is now stayed on the serum stage. So the others have more practical experience.
Can I help?
Yeah.
It's all right. Well, I traveled Scandinavian countries before the conference with my family, and before I came here, I visited Sweden, the Drottningholm Palace. Is that the right word? And I thought the concept of the landscape is totally different from what we have as an Asian, probably. I think the nature is more like in a Western culture, I feel like the nature can be tamed. Like the human being can, it's about the celebration for the human beings. But the nature for the Asians probably, like we, as you Chinese know, like we have the name is mountain, like the drawing, we have a very old drawing, like mountain and water. Shan Sui, is that right pronunciation? Yeah, Shan Sui drawing. It's mountain and water. It's all about basically our environment. And the water comes from the mountains, and the water generates our food and, you know, like life and everything. So I don't say that Westerners don't respect the nature, but we truly respect the nature as a god and also the ancestors, and that came from the geography and geographic. In my research, there was a big transition, and the origin of the landscape was started when the big topographic change happened in a medieval time. And it was really effective to make the use of the land in that sense. And we have that heritage for like 705 years. And our culture is totally westernized, as you know, like you pointed out that we're kind of like a Westerner, but we're actually not. But our culture is totally westernized, but we still carry on the heritage and tradition and relationship and everything, like invisible thing. So I think that's a great difference between Western and it is somehow related to the geography. I'm not sure if I answered.
We'll have to talk later. I have the question is based on when the Adirondacks in the U.S. are very wilderness-oriented, have many of the same ethics. But when you take summer usage and try and extend it into the winter time, the landscape is very unforgiving in terms of disposing of human waste in mountainous situations. And I was literally asking not a cultural aesthetics question, but protecting the landscape for future generations out of respect. And so if you have 120 kids in a camp. It's fine for the summertime, and everything works okay in the summertime. As soon as you try and put 20 people in a cabin in the wintertime, it's totally different. And I was saying, I missed that discussion as you talk about going from seasonal, easy access to difficult, delicate landscapes in the other 3 seasons. The U.S. Forest Service, when they do their mountain planning, they do a soil suitability study for where you can put more intense uses. And I was just wondering, is that anywhere in any of the kinds of things that you're thinking about, whether it's very urban next to a big river or whether it's up on a mountain plateau looking at the glacier? And I don't need the answer. I mean, I think I know the answers that people on my end, but I was wondering who else is doing that if not the landscape architects?
Yeah, well said, thank you. Him.
Hi.
Yeah.
Thank you. Excellent presentations, and all ladies. I'm so proud of.
Yeah.
I'm so proud of you. I just wanted to add a thought, and it's actually also in response to what you asked. I have been practicing in India as a landscape architect for a long time, 20 years, and I live in Sweden now for the last 2 years. And I think the one thing that Asian cultures bring to practice or to the landscapes is the storytelling. And that's what attracted me to cultural landscapes. And I went and did a degree in heritage, which was that we're always looking for concepts when we are creating designs or engaging. And a lot of what you presented today were those stories which, if they're in the right hands and the right place, right time, will become the new landscapes in the future. And I think, so that's one thing that we bring. The second I wanted to just add was that the one other thing that Asian cultures bring, and you mentioned about spirituality, in India I found it's a lot to do with land, like where you live. So like you said that in Japan, you mentioned the village. So in India, you would mention, if you're going to be moved around for rehabilitation or anything, it's the land where you were born and where your ancestors were, which is extremely important. So any dam project which relocates you, dislocates you, it's a huge thing because it's not the temple or that, it's the land, it's the actual spot where, and the third thing I just wanted to mention was the community part, and I've been traveling a lot. I've done a fair amount of work in China and in India, and I find a lot of times the top-down planning, and India, because of its colonial history, is really in the midst of this chaos, is that the top-down planning seems to have a certain way in which we approach landscapes and the way we think about stakeholder workshops. But I find that the most wonderful tips for how you have to go further in your landscapes come from these small community interactions. And I remember one, I'll quickly wrap up, I've taken too much time. There was one case in Ningbo. I was in Ningbo last year as part of an urban task force, and I was as a landscape architect, the rapporteur. And I was building this narrative on the culture-nature journey. And it was about the Jinmalu district, and it was a new road. It was the first road in that town, which we were discussing about. And suddenly this elderly gentleman in the stakeholder workshop came and said, I remember there were no roads, there were only streams. And I remember my granddad putting me on a boat and taking me right down this road, right down this stream. And suddenly, all of us started rethinking on the road and the little catch basins, which obviously had water under. And the whole narrative of what needed to be done was very clear with this one story. And so I would just say that that connection with our stories and our past, it's very deep in our culture. And when you're taken out of your environment into another environment, I think it comes out more strongly, and you realize that this is the value I add to this world, kind of thing. Thank you.
Thanks so much for that statement. That was really good. If there are no more pressing questions, comments, did you? No? Okay. So our time's up. So I'd just like to thank you so much for your presentations. I thought they were fantastic. So all of you did a really great job. Very clear. Thank you for participating as an audience. Thanks for your comments. You made, I think they were very valuable. So just like to thank our panel for their contribution.